All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Ostrowski. I work in EGLE's Environmental Support Division. I want to welcome you all to our meeting tonight, MPART PFAS Regional Informational Webinar for the Bay City region. This is the fourth regional webinar we've done the last 2 weeks. So I'm glad to see you all here. Looks like a few more people continue to join. That's fine. We're just going to start out by going through a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to Amy. So a webinar housekeeping, for those of you who've never joined us for a virtual public meeting before, a couple things to note. First of all lines are muted. It means that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. That's going to change when we get into the Q&A part, and I'll explain that in a minute. We're also recording this meeting, and we'll be posting it on the PFAS website when as soon as we can, so we'll get it posted up there. Tonight we're going to go through several presentations, and then we're going to open it up to questions and answers by our panel here. To submit a question, if you look on your Zoom toolbar, you'll see a Q&A box. You just open that up and type your question in and send it in, and we'll get it and we'll read it off for our team here to answer. If you like, you can also click the raise hand icon. And if you have a microphone, we will identify you and unmute your microphone so you can ask a question. Looks like we got a couple people on the phone, so if you're calling in phone only and not logged in, if you want to ask a question, you can type *9. So if you type *9, it raises your hand for us, and we will call on you, and we'll call on you by your phone number because we can't see your name. So that's how that is going to work. At this time, I'm going to turn over to Amy, and I'm going to let Mike take over the screen. So Mike, you can take over the screen, and Amy, you can take it away.
All right, very good. Thanks, Jim, and thanks everybody for joining us this evening. My name is Amy Peterson, and I'm EGLE's PFAS Operations Manager, and just want to spend a couple minutes talking to you about MPART. So Mike, if you could go to the next slide, please. Okay. Can we advance one more, Mike? It's still showing up on my screen.
I think he's just getting it set up still.
Okay.
Jim, I'm having the proverbial technical difficulties.
Yeah, Mike, if you just, we can see your screen. So if you just click in the middle of your screen somewhere and click to the next slide, if you can try that.
Great.
There you go.
There you go.
Thank you, Jim.
All right, perfect. Okay,
running
so,
two screens, so.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. So, yeah, MPART is the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, and we were set up under an executive order. It's a unique multi-agency approach, and it's coordinating the departments that are responsible for the environment, natural resources, public health, military installations, agriculture, fire stations, and commercial services at airports. So we are in regular communication with the state agencies, and we're also working with our federal partners on several projects. And then certainly once we find a PFAS site, we are working with local units of government as well. So we work across all agencies. We believe that Michigan has been successful in implementing a response to PFAS as effectively as we can because of the MPART structure and also because of our data-driven scientific-based approach. Next slide, please, Mike. Awesome. So when we talk about PFAS, we're talking about per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and that is the family of PFAS chemicals. There are over 5,000 of these compounds in existence today, and they're unique because they form strong carbon-fluorine bonds. They're some of the strongest bonds known to chemistry. These chemicals are surfactants. They repel water, oil, fat, and grease, and we began developing them in the 1940s. Next slide, please. So this slide shows several of the uses of PFAS in manufacturing, and some of the more common ones are probably the apparel and fabrics. If you think of your rain gear and also your stain-resistant carpeting, PFAS has been used in those materials. Down on the bottom right, you'll see food packaging has been used in that, and certainly the AFFF that has been used to put out fires. So next slide, please. So why we're concerned about PFAS is that they're widespread in the environment. They don't break down easily, so they're hard to get rid of, and some of them build up in our bodies. Some also have health effects associated with them, and Bill Farrell will talk a little bit about that. We lack information on a lot of these chemicals, and there is also a lack of national regulations. Next slide, please. So we like to show this diagram for a couple reasons. And for the people on the phone, what we have is a diagram that's showing on the left an industry. And let's say the industry is producing widgets. In the process of doing that, they're using PFAS in the manufacturing process. So after they are done with the processing, they may have wastewater, and they might be discharging that wastewater directly into a stream. We call those direct discharges. They could, on the other hand, be sending that wastewater to our wastewater treatment plant. But even if they're doing that, wastewater treatment plants weren't designed to be treating PFAS. So they then, in turn, might just be discharging that directly into a stream. Wastewater treatment plants also often have sludge they're dealing with, and that's just going into the landfills. Wastewater treatment plants are also often dealing with biosolids, and that's being applied to our produce. So you can see how we're kind of cycling this around. But the other reason we like to share this diagram is because it's also pointing to the places where we are looking for and sampling for PFAS. So back to our industrial users and wastewater treatment plants, there's sampling going on either by them or through MPART at our direct discharges at the wastewater treatment plants. There's leachate sampling being done by landfills. We've done biosolid sampling, and up in the top right corner, you see residential homes. Certainly, as soon as we learn of a new PFAS site, we share the information with the local units of, with the local health departments and DHHS, and the first thing we do is make sure there's no residential homes in harm's way. Next slide, please. So MPART uses kind of a three-pronged approach to looking for PFAS. We do surface water investigations, public water supply sampling, and we do groundwater investigations. So with the surface water investigations, we talked about the wastewater piece of it a moment ago. We're also doing surveys of surface water and fish around the state. And if we find hits in our surface water above our water quality standards, we will work upstream until we find the sources. Now, foam is mentioned here because the foam sightings that we get from people, we are incorporating into our surface water sampling plans. So, next slide, please. So this next slide talks about the public water supply testing that was done by EGLE in 2018 and 19. That includes community water supplies, tribal systems, schools and daycares. And then after we did the initial round of sampling, we went back and did some additional sampling at some of our surface water systems and some other places. So next slide, please. So this slide, again, for those on the phone, is showing a pie chart of the results of that statewide public water supply sampling. And each of those samples were analyzed for the 14 compounds that were listed there. And what the pie chart shows is that 90% of the samples came back non-detect for all 14 of those compounds. 7% of the samples came back less than 10 parts per trillion total PFAS. So a total of all those compounds added together. And then 3% had results over 10 parts per trillion of the total PFAS. Again, those 14 added together. Of those 3%, there were 3 systems that exceeded the EPA lifetime health advisory level of 70 parts per trillion PFAS plus PFOA, which is when MPART kicked into gear and we got all of our resources and all of our agencies together, and we mobilized an immediate response. So what we did with these results is we shared them online in the interest of transparency, and we also shared them, of course, with the public water supplies, along with recommendations related to monitoring, notifying the public that they served, and depending on the results, potentially recommending that they look into potential sources and then options for treatment should they need to do that. Next slide, please. So the thing about the water quality, the public water standards is there were no national standards to adopt. So what we did is we invoked a science advisory panel, and they produced a report in December of 2018 that informed us of 2 things. One, that our 70 parts per trillion PFOS plus PFOA added together was too high. They also said that other PFAS should be considered, not just the PFOS and the PFOA. So we then implemented a 2-step approach. We put together a science advisory work group, and they came up with health-based values that then fed into and informed our rulemaking process. So next one, please. So what you see here is that on August 3rd of this year, Michigan promulgated drinking water standards. These drinking water standards apply to 2,700 water systems. The first column there is the PFAS chemical. The second column shows the maximum contaminant level. And then you can see the EPA's recommendation is still at the 70 parts per trillion combined. So the interesting thing to point out here, the MCLs, those numbers really range from 6 parts per trillion to 400 parts per trillion. And that just kind of gives you an idea of how, variable these PFAS chemicals behave in the environment. So the other thing I'll point out here is that the PFOS and PFOA are circled here because, again, EPA's recommendation was combined of those two compounds. The MCLs under the drinking water standards, those are individual now, and they are now 8 parts per trillion PFOA and 16 PFOS. Next slide, please. Now, the thing to remember is the 7 MCLs there do not automatically convert then into groundwater cleanup criteria. Because groundwater cleanup criteria was already in rule for the PFOS and PFOA, those numbers automatically dropped from the 70 combined PFOS plus PFOA, now got dropped in August 3rd to the 8 and the 16. So those are the numbers now in play for groundwater cleanup criteria, and that's what makes an MPART site. Rulemaking is going to be necessary for those 5 other MCLs to become groundwater cleanup criteria, and we're walking through all this stuff so you understand how we are defining a PFAS site. So that takes us to the next slide. So on this slide, we have a map showing in 2 different colors the MPART sites. And the sites that are noted in purple are the ones that exceeded our criteria when it was 70 parts per trillion PFOS plus PFOA added together. So we had 91 of those sites. On August 3rd, our universe expanded because our groundwater cleanup criteria went into place, and those numbers dropped again to the 8 and the 16, not added together. So we now have 148 sites that qualify because they exceeded our groundwater cleanup criteria. So going back to the third phase of our third prong of our approach, EGLE is going to continue prioritizing our investigations based on known or suspected sources and the potential for exposure. And our primary goal is protecting drinking water pathways. Next slide, please. So the final thing I'll mention is a citizen advisory work group. This is an arm of MPART. This is a group that consists of residents from impacted communities. And their key charge is to provide recommendations to MPART on how to engage and empower communities and how to educate the general public. We are looking for new members. If there's anybody interested from an impacted community, this group meets the second Tuesday each month from 6 to 7:30. So if you're interested, reach out to me or to Steve Slider, who's the MPART Executive Director. And with that, we can go to the next slide, and I will pass it to Bill Farrell. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. My name is Bill Farrell. I'm a toxicologist with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. And I also manage our DHHS toxicologists who work collaboratively with EGLE, local public health, and the other state agencies to investigate these PFAS sites and respond to any necessary response actions. So next slide, please, Mike. As I said, our DHHS and local public health provide the public health response activities for these PFAS sites. Our primary role is to try and understand the health concerns facing the community. And again, we work with EGLE as well as other agencies to investigate these sites. We work with EGLE to develop plans to investigate and address health risks. EGLE leads the site investigation, and then MDHHS and the local health departments lead the public health planning and response actions. And we evaluate PFAS exposures to residents in the community. At a lot of these sites, most of the work that we do in terms of assessing PFAS exposures is through drinking water. With a lot of these sites, these PFAS sites, we have impacted residential wells. So we work with the local health department to evaluate the results and convey those results to the residents so that they can understand what they're being exposed to and what the potential risks are. So next slide, please. Exposure to PFAS. So, as Amy mentioned, there's many different PFAS chemicals, and they've been used in all kinds of different industrial and commercial applications. With respect to exposure, the most significant route of exposure is ingestion. And we're most significantly, with respect to the sites that we look at, the most significant exposure comes from drinking PFAS with water that's impacted. You also can have exposure to PFAS by eating contaminated fish. As Amy mentioned, these PFAS chemicals bioaccumulate, so they tend to become, once biota are exposed to them, they build up in the biota, fish, wildlife, and humans. So incidental swallowing of contaminated soil or dust is another route of exposure. Eating food packaged in materials containing PFAS. PFAS historically was used in a lot of fast food wrappers, pizza boxes, and that, again, because of the unique properties. Consumer products, dental floss historically had PFAS, cosmetics historically had PFAS. And like I said, ingestion of PFAS is the main route of exposure. PFAS absorption through the skin is typically not a concern because these chemicals are not easily absorbed through the skin. Next slide, please, Mike. This slide shows you the average levels of certain PFAS chemicals in the blood of citizens in the United States. As I mentioned, PFAS is used in many different industrial applications, all kinds of consumer products and that. And as a result of that, everybody's been exposed to PFAS. And in 2000, as part of a nutritional survey that CDC has been doing for years, they started measuring the amount of PFAS in people's blood. And this particular figure shows the levels of PFAS beginning in 2000. And I think one of the most important things to note on this particular slide is that you see a decrease in the concentrations of PFAS over time. So if you look at the top line, which is the average concentration of PFOS, in 2000, it was about 30 micrograms per liter. And then as you see, over the years to 2014, the concentrations have declined over time to where the concentration today is about 6 parts per billion. And the reason for that is around 2002, the United States stopped the manufacture and use of PFAS, of PFOS and PFOA in products that were manufactured in the United States. So as a result of stopping the use of and manufacture of those two particular PFAS in products manufactured in the United States, you had a decline in exposure to that. So consequently, we've seen the levels of these of PFOS and PFOA and these other PFAS decrease in people's blood over time. So next slide, please. So what do we know about the toxicity of these compounds? Most of what we know about the toxicity of these compounds comes from studies of two specific PFAS, PFOA and PFOS. And adverse health effects have been established in both epidemiological and animal laboratory studies for these particular PFAS chemicals. And then this slide shows some of the adverse health effects in humans associated with high levels of PFAS exposure from epidemiological studies. And these adverse health effects include lowering a woman's chance of getting pregnant, increasing the chance of high blood pressure in pregnant women, increasing the chance of thyroid disease, increasing cholesterol levels, changing immune response, and increasing cancers, in particular kidney and testicular cancers. So I think I'll turn this over to Mike now. All set.
Hi, Mike Jury. I'm the regional lead for EGLE and MPART working with PFAS. That's my contact information there. And you don't have to write too fast because we'll have this at the end also and the recording will be made available. So what sites are we going to go over tonight? We're going to go over the two that are in Bay County. That would be GM Powertrain in the city of Bay City and Dow Chemical's former ITI facility also in Bay City. We'll be looking at the Cove landfill, Huron landfill complex property in Huron County. In Saginaw County, People's Landfill and the former Saginaw Malleable iron plant. And then in Sanilac County, we'll be looking at Tri-City Recycling and Disposal Facility, also known as the Messman site. And Amanda Armbruster, our project manager for GM Powertrain, will start us off. Amanda?
All right, thanks, Mike. As Mike just said, I'm a geologist and project manager for EGLE's Remediation and Redevelopment Division. I work out of the Bay City District Office. This first site, like Mike said, is GM Powertrain. It's located right in the city of Bay City, directly adjacent to the Saginaw River. It's been an active automotive facility since the early 1900s. And EGLE recently in 2019 asked GM to perform some PFAS sampling to evaluate potential risks associated with PFAS. And the reason we had concerns about this site in particular was because of historic plating operations, including chrome, copper, and nickel plating. So groundwater from this site flows towards the Saginaw River, and we have not identified any residential drinking water wells around the perimeter of this site that we believe are at risk because the majority of this area is all on municipal water. So go ahead and advance, Mike. This is an aerial of the plant. It is currently active, as many of you may know. And like I said, back in 2019, when we asked GM to sample for PFAS, they went ahead and they took samples from 6 on-site monitoring wells. Those samples were collected in June of 2019. There's a couple monitoring wells that had detections of PFAS. Monitoring well MW406S, which is right behind the plant, had a concentration of PFOA at 21 parts per trillion. And as you heard earlier, the cleanup criteria for that compound is 8. Monitoring well LMW6S had a concentration of PFOS of 24 parts per trillion. And the current criteria for that one is 16 parts per trillion. As you can see in the image, those are some lagoons associated with plant operations. And one thing to note about this site is that there is an active groundwater recovery system on the property. There is sheet piling that's intended to help prevent groundwater from migrating from this property into the Saginaw River. So those are a couple things that were put into place historically associated with historic contamination on this property, primarily PCBs. So we don't really believe that there's a strong likelihood that there's PFAS migrating off this property. There is groundwater conducted annually, and we anticipate that we may be asking GM to do some additional sampling in the future for PFAS. So are there any, I think maybe we're waiting till the end for questions, unless we're doing that now, or we can just move on to the next one.
Not seeing any questions, so we'll be able to move on to the next one. And I'll be covering the Dow Chemical International Terminals site, which is in Bay City and is also on the Saginaw River and happens to be pretty darn close to almost across the river from this site. The project manager for this site, Melissa Uvan, was not available tonight, and so I'm covering for her, but her contact information will be at the end of the program. So the Dow Chemical ITI Facility, if you know where the USS Edson is, then you know where this is. This is underneath the area of the parking lot and around the Edson. The area, the Dow Chemical Facility was historically used for chemical storage, different types of chemicals were stored in tanks. And when we looked at historic maps, there were a couple tanks that said foam on them. So that made us start to think perhaps they were storing firefighting foam at this site. The site was sampled for PFAS compounds in 2017, and the highest concentrations that we've seen on site are PFOA, with the highest result at 62.4 parts per trillion, which exceeds the criteria that you heard was 8 parts per trillion. Fortunately, groundwater flow is towards the Saginaw River, and that's fortunate because the site has a groundwater collection system that draws the groundwater into to sumps, and that material is then discharged to West Bay County's municipal wastewater treatment plant. So far as we know, the known PFOA concentrations above criteria are limited to 1 extraction well and 1 monitoring well, and then consequently, as that water goes into that sump is also contaminated. Because of the presence of that extraction system and the groundwater flow towards the Saginaw River, it's not very likely that PFOA is going off-site or impacting any residential wells. In talking with the Bay County Health Department and looking through well logs that we have in EGLE, we've not really found anything too close to the site, and it is serviced by municipal drinking water. There is a restricted covenant from 1996 that prohibits the installation of wells for potable use on the property, meaning drinking water. And currently Dow Chemical continues to operate the groundwater collection system and will continue to monitor for PFAS compounds. And we'd like to move on to our next site. And that'll be Lori Babcock, who will cover the Cove and Huron landfills in Huron County. Lori?
Hello, I'm Lori. I'm the geologist in the Materials Management Division of the Bay City District Office. All right, so I'll be talking about Cove and Huron landfills property. This is a little confusing, but the point is we have 2 different properties and 2 different owners. So at the east there, we have Cove landfill. That is a closed, considered to be unlined landfill. It's been closed for at least 30 years at this point. It is unfortunately tax reverted to Huron County. And then to the west is Huron landfill. That's a modern landfill, currently active, licensed, operating, owned by Amterra. But Cove landfill has a history of groundwater contamination, and interesting relationship there. Huron landfill does not own Cove, but it is responsible for doing the groundwater monitoring at Cove. So we asked Huron to sample for PFAS at wells that are just between the 2 sites. And what we found was 58 parts per trillion PFOA just between the 2 at monitoring well 3S. It also had 11 parts per trillion PFOS, not quite above the maximum contaminant level, but still notable. And then just to the south, monitoring well 3D had 14 parts per trillion PFOA. All right, next slide, please. So notably, groundwater flows towards the northwest. So generally from Cove toward Huron, we're going to be sampling residential wells in the surrounding area that are northwest of the site for PFAS. That does it for Cove and Huron.
Right, thank you so much, Lori. Moving on to Saginaw County, Lori is going to cover People's Landfill. That's in Birch Run, so please, if you would.
All right, so People's Landfill, another active site. Next slide. But a lot of our active sites have areas that are older, they're closed, they may not have modern liners to limit or actually prevent landfill leachate from migrating into the groundwater. So People's Landfill has an older closed area toward the south, and it had a history of groundwater contamination, and it was previously addressed by a remedial action plan. Big part of that was a slurry wall was constructed along the southern border of the landfill to limit groundwater migration. And we had people's landfill sample these wells, and we found a few of them above the maximum contaminant level. So towards the west, you have monitoring well 101. That was actually 12 parts per trillion PFOA. And just to the southeast of that, monitoring well 102 also had 12 parts per trillion PFOA. Surface water was also sampled here, the Silver Creek, marked on the map as SWMP1, and did find 3.6 parts per trillion PFOA and PFOS. Those were not above the maximum contaminant levels. All right, next slide. In this area, the groundwater flows generally toward the south. So due to those exceedances, we will be conducting residential drinking water well sampling. A number of homes are on municipal water in the area, but we've identified the ones that have wells, and we'll be in touch on that. And that's all for Peoples.
Thank you, Lori. And staying in Saginaw County and moving up north, we'll be covering Saginaw Malleable Iron, and Amanda Armbruster will be covering that site for us tonight.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Go ahead and move to the next slide. This is another former automotive facility. This was a former foundry that operated for almost 100 years. There's also a large landfill on this property. The property in total is over 300 acres in size. You'll see in an aerial in the next slide where these areas were located previously. But there was the former plant area, a large landfill, Greenpoint landfill, and a couple smaller foundry fill landfills on this property. Groundwater flow is primarily towards the Saginaw River. However, there are several wetlands throughout the property, so the groundwater does flow in some other directions in some localized areas. There are private water wells that we believe may be present along Riverside Boulevard, which is a bit of a distance to the south of the property along the Tittabawassee River. However, after consultation with the local health department, we believe that all those homes have access to municipal water and are likely using municipal water and not their private wells. Groundwater use restrictions are in place on the property, and there are currently no municipal water hookups or any other utilities that are currently on the property, and the surrounding area is serviced by municipal water. Go ahead and advance, Mike. So in order to evaluate the potential for PFAS contamination on this property, EGLE asked Racer Trust, who is the responsible party for the contamination out here, to sample the groundwater for PFAS. So in December of 2018, 12 wells were sampled on site. 3 of those wells had concentrations above the current cleanup criteria for PFOA and PFOS. Monitoring well X2A, which is, if you can see right in the center of this image, you'll see a little bit of a mound. That is where Greenpoint landfill is located. And on the northeastern edge of that landfill is where that particular well is located. That well had 50.6 parts per trillion PFOA and 16.5 parts per trillion PFOS. There was recently a secondary sampling event that was conducted in August and September. We have, I think there were 14 samples that were taken from various monitoring wells across the property. We have results for about 10 of them in, and 4 of them are still pending. But so far, based on the results that have come in, the concentrations are fairly consistent with the results that we saw back in 2018.
Thank you, Amanda.
Mm-hmm.
And that moves us on to Sanilac County, which will bring us back to Lori again. And she'll be covering Tri-City's recycling and disposal facility, the Messman site.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so in this case, it's emphasis on Messman site. So Waste Management owns Tri-City Recycling and Disposal Facility. That's an active licensed landfill. The Messman site is also part of the property. It is an older, closed, online landfill. So that had previously known groundwater contamination. It led to a consent judgment in 1989. Not unlike People's Landfill, a slurry wall was constructed around the Messman site to limit any contaminated groundwater flow. But due to that existing contamination, we requested sampling around the Messman site. And at one well, that's TC110A, PFOA was at 10 parts per trillion, just over 8 parts per trillion, and then PFOS was 18 parts per trillion. Next slide, please. In this area, the groundwater flow is toward the northeast, so toward the Black River, and due to that, and residential homes in the area, we will be doing PFAS sampling at those wells.
Great, thank you, Lori. So we wanted to let you see who the contact information were for the site leads for the different properties. And as I said, this will be available online. We are recording this presentation. So I will give you a moment if there's one of the sites that you're interested in. I'll give you a moment here to write down names and numbers. And while you're doing that, if you have some questions that you'd like to ask any of our site leads or anything else about these sites, we certainly welcome that. And you have that function. Jim, maybe you would like to tell them once again on how to go ahead and ask questions.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. So I'm gonna bring this back to me. So if everybody just kind of stand by for a second. All right, so yeah, thank you all for presentations. We got a few different ways to ask questions. That's what we're here for, to ask questions. We got a big team here that can get those addressed. You can type your question into the question box on your Zoom toolbar. See a QA box there, type it in and we'll read it off. You can also raise your hand and we'll unmute your mic if you'd like. There's a few of you that are on the phone I can see. So if you're calling in phone only, if you want to ask a question, just click on *9. Click *9, it raises your hand for us to see, and we will call on you that way too. So I will let you all type your questions in, and I'm going to bring back that slide that Mike, you had up. While here's the health department slide too, so I'll leave that up there for a second as well while we look at questions. So if the team is ready here, it looks like we got a couple of them coming in. The first question is for Lori, and it says, what is the timeline on contacting residents and collecting well water samples for the Cove Huron landfill site?
For the Cove site, we expect those letters to go out in the next week. So right now, really.
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. All right, thanks. And I don't know if this is for you, Lori, or for maybe the whole team. I don't know if this is something that Amy or Mike could be able to address this. How soon are the residents expected to hear from you? Will the residents have to pay for the testing? So I don't know if that's in general for any new PFAS site or if it's just for a specific one. But can one of you explain how that works in general, maybe first?
Sure. No, there is no charge to the homeowner. The letters will go out and we'll seek your information. And obviously we need a contact number to get a hold of you so that we can talk to you and set up an appointment to get your sample. If you have concerns about a sampler One of the ways that we are able to take a sample is through the hose bib on the outside of your home. If you're not happy with that, there are other methods to collect a sample. Then once we collect the sample, it will go to our EGLE laboratory to be analyzed. And normally that's a process that takes a couple weeks. And then, so normally within a month, we would have your information to you. Then when you have those results, you're able to talk to either your county health department or to the state health department and have those results interpreted for you if you have some type of detections. We all hope that you have no detections at all, in which case then there's not anything that has to be done. And then of course, depending if something is found, then we have to talk to you about what do those results mean, and that would be where your local health department or Bill Farrell will come in, or one of his staff, to talk about that. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, Mike, there's a clarification on how soon will residents be expected to hear from you. The person says it was People's Landfill, the People's Landfill site.
Well, that's Lori's, and go ahead, Lori.
Okay, so I've finalized that. So in the next week or so, I'm hoping to have everything out to answer your question.
Okay. This question is for regarding surface water testing. I don't think Brandon's on, but whoever you want to direct this one to, it says, with so many locations close to the Saginaw River, has there been any comprehensive testing of surface water for PFAS? If an impact, any limits on fish or wildlife? So maybe Tammy could address the fish and wildlife question.
Yeah, I'll take the first part.
Okay.
If Brandon on, I guess we should find that out first.
Oh, no, yeah. There is Brandon. Okay, yep.
Yeah, because he'll be able to tell you about the study that was done.
Yeah, so we first collected fish from the Saginaw River in 2013. We collected bass, pumpkin seed, and carp. PFAS was found in all three of those species. And currently there's an advisory for the Saginaw River for several species due to PCBs and dioxins. But PFAS does cause advisories in the sunfish, bluegill, and some smaller sized bass. So I would have those fishermen fishing the Saginaw River tune into the Eat Safe Fish website to get more details on the fish consumption advisories. And then, as far as surface water goes, we did conduct a study in 2019. We collected surface water samples from several locations throughout the Saginaw River, and overall concentrations were relatively low, less than around 2 parts per trillion. But again, when we went out and sampled last fall, there was a lot of high water at the time. So we're going to repeat that sampling hopefully next year, and do some follow-up sampling around some of these new sites. And then also we recently collected fish again from the Saginaw River in Essexville, also downstream of the Middle Ground Landfill, and at Center Street, which would be downstream of that one of those newer PFAS sites upstream in the Saginaw River. Those results won't be available until probably sometime this winter or early next year.
Thanks, okay. Brandon.
Yeah, so the second part of that question, thanks, Brandon, was if there's an impact, any limits on fish or wildlife?
Yeah, so there are fish consumption advisories for several species of fish in the Saginaw River. Again, I would have fishermen tune into that Eat Safe Fish website to get specific details on how much fish you should be eating.
Okay. Here's another question. Will well samples be taken further out from the wells that exceed the threshold?
Well, so we're going to start out collecting residential wells a certain distance from the landfills that we're concerned about. And then based on those results, that'll help determine how much farther out we need to move. So we don't start out at a 5-mile radius, we start in a lot closer. And of course, we look at different things in determining which homes to sample. We look at well depths, we look at which way groundwater flows, we look at geology in the area. And so a lot of thought goes into which wells to sample. and to determine how and when to do that sampling. So residents that we believe should be sampled should get a letter in the mail, and those letters will be from Lori because those are the sites currently that we're looking at to do residential sampling.
Right, thanks. So I'm looking at my question board and I don't have any other questions coming in, and I do not see any hands raised. So we'll give it a few minutes and see if more people want to chime in with their questions or raise their hand. While we're waiting, a couple of you have been on some of the other sessions that we've held around the state. I don't know if any of you that have been on before want to chime in with any of the questions that might have popped up before that you think might be of interest to this group, any frequently asked questions, things that have come up in some of the other sessions. It's all right. I will mention
We
too
might
that
ask specifically, Jim, is there a method for the folks that are on the phone, if they have a question, can you unmute them in case they're having some difficulties with raising their hand?
yeah, well, the only way I know if somebody on the phone wants to talk is if you hit *9.
Okay.
And if you hit *9, that tells me that you have a
Great.
question and we can unmute you. That's no problem. One thing that we should point out is that information about all the sites we've talked about today and other sites around Michigan can be found on the PFAS website, the michigan.gov/PFAS response. If you go there, you can click, I think it's on site investigations or investigations, and you can actually look at an interactive map of all the different sites by county, which is kind of neat, especially when you're talking about regional issues. So you can go and look at all the sites maybe in your county and drill down and look at specific ones and the information we have.
Hey, Jim, this is Amy Peterson.
Hey, Amy.
We can also mention that, this is being recorded, and after it's closed caption, it will be placed on the MPART website. And easiest way to find that is go to the very top of the MPART website, and where we have an announcement right now about each of these upcoming webinars, there's a little blurb underneath that you can click on. It'll take you where the recorded webinars are.
That's right. Yep. Another question came in. What methods of remedy is there for a residential well that exceeds the threshold?
Well, I'll start. We have Ian on also, Ian Smith from our drinking water program. Let's have Ian go ahead and answer that question.
Okay.
If he can. If not, I'll take care of it then.
Sorry, Mike, I had to find my...
Yeah, that's fine.
Well, I can speak about that a little bit from the point of view of a public water system, but Mike, I may need your help with residential wells as well as help from MDHHS. But speaking more broadly, there are technologies available to remove PFAS from drinking water. The one that we point to in our PFAS rules that were just promulgated is granular activated carbon, which is a well-known effective treatment technique for removing PFAS from drinking water. There are some other technologies available, including reverse osmosis and ionic resin, which work in slightly different ways, but also can effectively remove those compounds. All of these different methods have, while effective at removing PFAS, are going to have different things that you need to consider. And again, I'm speaking primarily from the point of view of a public water supply, and I apologize for that. That's the program that I live in. But for example, if a public water supply were to utilize reverse osmosis, while it is a very effective way to remove PFAS, you do have to account for the fact that you are now collecting PFAS that would need to be disposed of later. I guess I would kick that question over perhaps to Bill Farrell to see if he has anything to add as far as treatment options for individual residential homes.
Yeah. While Bill's getting online, we have successfully installed treatment systems for homeowners across the state. in various locales, and we've used reverse osmosis. We have used granular activated carbon. I'm not positive that we've used any ion exchange resin yet, but we do have quite a few systems that have been put in place around the state. So also we use certified systems certified by the National Sanitation Foundation so that we can be assured that whatever system is put in is capable of taking out PFAS that in the water. So Bill, are you on yet?
It was just there a minute ago.
Yeah,
Well,
well,
pop back up again. So
yeah. So anyway, we do, as I said, do have systems in place in various parts of the state, whether it be in Rockford associated with Wolverine Worldwide, Oscoda associated with the old Air Force facility, Grayling, other places in the state too. DHHS is going back and relooking at those installations to make sure that they still are effective and that they will do the job of taking PFAS out. So it's kind of a long-winded answer to probably a fairly simple question. What do you do with this stuff? And so that is what we do. We put in systems to take out the PFAS.
And I would add just one more thing to the long-windedness, if you don't mind, Mike. I know that MPART does maintain a page on the MPART website on in-home treatment options. So that may be a good resource for the person asking the question as well.
Right. Thank you, Ian.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot Pellston too. There are filter systems in Pellston, Michigan also.
okay, I think we might have lost Bill. he was on, but he might have had issues, technical issues. Okay, everybody. I have sent out a few links in the chat, linking to different spots on our MPART PFAS website that you might want to check out. And I am looking at our board, Mike, and I'm not seeing any other questions. That's fine. If you don't have any questions, that's fine. But that's why we're here today, to help get your questions answered if you had some.
And of course, they should feel free if you have questions about a site that you live nearby or a site that you're interested in. Please contact the site lead for that. Once again, going back to that slide, Amanda is covering the General Motors sites, GM Powertrain, Saginaw, Malleable. For Dow Chemical in Bay City, it's Melissa. And Lori has the rest of them, all those different landfill sites that we mentioned tonight. So if you have questions, you certainly can contact them. You can contact me. You can contact MPART. So we would be thrilled to hear from you so that we can certainly get your questions answered.
All right. Well, with that, you know, I guess we'll start to wrap it up then. So I don't know if Amy or Mike, do you guys have any parting comments or thoughts that you might want to go over?
This is Amy. I appreciate everybody taking the time out this evening to learn about these sites, and I'll echo the sentiment here. If anybody has any questions or issues, feel free to reach out to any of us. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. I don't know what it's like in the Bay Area, but in East Lansing here, it's a beautiful evening out. So hopefully we can all get out and enjoy it before it gets too dark. I want to thank you all for tuning in tonight, and just want to remind you that, like Amy said earlier, we did record the webinar, and we'll be sharing it on the PFAS website, michigan.gov/PFAS response. And for those of you that I have emails for, we'll shoot an email out to you as well with a link to that. And so if there's someone that you thought might have wanted to see it and missed it, you can forward it on to them. That's going to come out in the next few days. So if you're anxious, you want to see it, it'll probably be up earlier on the PFAS website. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your evening. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.